Go back in time with me about 25 years to 1990. In many ways, despite some really egregious fashion choices, this was a very hopeful time. We had the breakup of the Soviet Union, the liberation of Eastern Europe from communism, the reunification of Germany, Nelson Mandela's release from prison, the end of the Cold War. It seemed that maybe the world could finally say goodbye to all those years of conflict and violence. Maybe people wouldn't have to live under the shadow of nuclear annihilation anymore. Also, I was in 8th grade, and I thought there was a very legitimate chance that some girls might want to kiss me. Famously, in the summer of 1989, a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history. He wrote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." In other words, looking into the future, Fukuyama saw the rest of the world becoming more and more like us. Capitalist, democratic, secular, wealthy, at peace. You're watching from that future right now, so you already know. Most of those dreams didn't come true. I mean, the kissing thing kind of worked out eventually, but it took a lot longer than I thought it would. And as for the rest, well, the world today is a lot wealthier than it's ever been. It's probably more capitalist, and by some measures at least, it might be more peaceful. But when we look across the globe today, we don't see a lot of consensus about what really matters in life, about the kind of societies people want to live in, the kind of world they want to build. Instead, what a lot of people see is a clash of civilizations. You've probably heard that term before, clash of civilizations. But what does it actually mean? And where does it come from? The idea goes back to another political scientist, Samuel Huntington. In 1993, in an article that was kind of a response to Fukuyama, Huntington argued that the end of the Cold War would not mean the end of history. We were not about to see a world full of Western-style secular democracies just like ours. Instead, things like ideology and economics and even nationality would become less and less important, while things like ethnicity and religion and culture would become more and more important. Huntington saw a globe divided up into a few major world civilizations: Western, Islamic, Orthodox, Chinese, Latin American, Hindu, Buddhist, African. Critically, the more these civilizations came into contact with each other, the sharper the differences between them would become. As Huntington wrote, "It is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future." Or, more memorably, the next world war, if it comes, will be a war of civilizations. So, more than 20 years later, what should we think of all this clash of civilizations stuff? Well, let's start with the positives. First, Huntington was right to point out that culture is important, like really important. You just can't understand what people do in the world without understanding the way they see the world, the things they value in it. Second, A lot of the turmoil that we've seen in the past 25 years fits pretty well into Huntington's theory. The civil war that's happening right now in Ukraine looks a lot like a conflict between Russian-speaking Easterners, who identify more with Moscow and the Orthodox world, and Ukrainian-speaking Westerners, who identify more with the European Union. Or think of the conflicts between Hindu and Muslim in Kashmir, between Jew and Palestinian in Israel and the occupied territories, between the Muslim North and the Christian and animist South in Sudan. Or look at the former Yugoslavia, all the bloodshed between Western Catholic Slovenes and Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Montenegrins, and Macedonians, and Muslim Bosnians and Kosovars. And yeah, if you want, you can also throw in Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Finally, people sometimes like to accuse Huntington of warmongering, so it's really important to remember he was predicting a clash of civilizations. He was not advocating one. In fact, one of his major conclusions is that we in the West can't just assume that our ways are always universal and best. Other civilizations have a legitimate claim to life on this world, and we have to learn to coexist with them. Okay, how about the negatives? 1. Huntington's system is simple. Probably way too simple. By concentrating only on conflicts between civilizations, he basically ignores all the tensions and conflicts that develop within civilizations, and these have turned out to be hugely significant. Just think about all the upheavals that have engulfed so much of the Islamic world recently. Wars and revolutions in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain. The United States has been involved in a few of these, but they aren't really conflicts between Islam and the West. They're conflicts within Islam, between Sunni and Shia, between moderates and fundamentalists, between autocratic rulers and reformers and revolutionaries. Culture is central to a lot of this, but not in the simplistic way that Huntington describes it. 2. The single worst military conflict in the history of the world since the Second World War occurred in... where? Take a guess. Seriously, imagine I can hear you. What do you think? And the answer is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Surprised? Most people would be. But what we now call the Second Congo War broke out in 1998. It ran for about 5 years. It involved 9 separate countries and more than 20 different armed groups. And it caused more than 5 million deaths. Truly horrific, catastrophic. So what was it all about? Well, access to natural resources, clan and factional rivalries, poverty, corruption, post-colonial instability, corporate greed, lots of things. But a clash over cultural identity? Not so much, really. And if your theory of human conflict in the post-Cold War world cannot explain the single worst human conflict in the post-Cold War world, maybe you need to work on your theory. Finally, 3. Look, call me a naive, starry-eyed idealist, but when people from different civilizations come into contact with one another, clashing isn't the only thing they do, right? The reason that we enjoy such a rich, varied global culture today is that in addition to killing each other, we also sometimes enter into conversation. We question, we inspire, we argue, we buy and sell, we romance, we influence, we cooperate. Every aspect of our lives today is a result of those mutual influences between civilizations. That's who we are. Let's try not to forget it.